Hey guys, it's Scott from fxmissions.com. Just a note, I've finished the trilogy of anthologies from the forefront, and all 3 books are currently available on Amazon.
Welcome to From the Forefront, an FX Missions podcast with your host, Scott McClelland. Far and wide, and sometimes here at home, these bold and courageous souls that answer the call to missions have a steely metal that insists pioneering be part of their daily routine. Let's gather today and learn from those on the forefront. Here's Scott.
Hi, Scott McClelland here with your FX Missions From the Forefront podcast. Thanks for joining us. Please share this content and our other podcast, Leadership Moment, with friends who you know might be interested in the subject of missions or leadership. Happy to be an encouragement to you. We're excited today to be joined by Kerry Olson. Good morning, Kerry.
Good morning from Mexico City.
Great to have you on here. Yeah, and so what's the season like? I know we're in a weird season in the world right now, but what's the season like in Mexico City right now? Is it spring? What's going on there?
Well, we do have the 4 seasons here, although we're quite high in elevation, almost 8,000 feet. So, it's about 70 degrees all year round where we live. But when we come out of the mountains, it gets even warmer, but we enjoy being a little bit cooler because of the elevation.
Yeah, I love the weather in Mexico City. Of course, I'm overwhelmed by Mexico City. I got to say that. I've been through there many, many times, and I still feel like I'm overmatched, especially if I'm driving in Mexico City. But you've been there a while. I think you mentioned, is it 30 or 30 plus years?
34 years.
34 years.
First 10 years we were
Wow.
in northern Mexico, and then the last almost 25 here in the big city.
Big city, yeah, absolutely. But you're not from Mexico City, and to me, I'm from Texas, so hopefully not everything that normally infers, but our accents are different, is what I'm trying to say. So I think I'm the one with the accent, but you're from the Midwest or maybe a little North Midwest, huh?
Yeah, my family comes from Minnesota originally, and when I was about 12, they moved out to the West Coast, but I was only there for my formative years, about 10 years old to 17, and then I left to the mission field. So basically,
Wow.
Most of my life's been on the field.
Wow. Well, so, this is, my mind goes in so many directions, and there's a lot to get to. I appreciate you being on here, but anyone who's been on the field, kind of in terms of the length of time you've seen a lot, the changes in approach and the way people are, syncing up to the work in our times. And then, I feel the pain of probably you've seen a lot of people come and go from the field as well. It's very unusual that someone would have that kind of persistent history abroad for the gospel. Does something come to mind you'd like to mention about that?
Well, it is becoming more unusual to have long-term missionaries on the field. Of course, I had numerous short-term experiences before I went long-term, and I think that's the joy of missions is that, short-term leads to long-term. Most of my life has been ministry life, has been mobilizing nationals to go long-term as well. And of course, some of those go short-term and mid-term, but that's really where my heart is. We really can't understand a culture until we learn the language. And, learning a language is not something that's done in 12 months' time. It takes a long time. And through learning language, you understand the culture.
Yeah. Wow. I'm continuing to learn Spanish.
Well, it's one of the easier languages, and I know you do well.
I just think that's funny. I'm doing better. Let's say that. But over the last 3 or 4 years, my Spanish has gotten, I think, more useful, more usable, maybe is a good way to say it. But it's such a beautiful language, obviously. Complexity is, it's probably not Mandarin, but it's north of English when it comes to complexity, at least from my point of view. But I love it. It's great. And I certainly love the culture of Latin America. So very, very cool. Did you start out in Spanish-speaking environments for missions?
Well, actually, during my years of study, first at YWAM, which is the University of the Nations now in Kona, Hawaii, I was back there right out of high school, 1977 to 79. I actually thought that I'd be with YWAM in Argentina my entire life, but I was just there
Ah,
for a little less than a year, and I knew that God had called me to Latin America. That had been confirmed through a number of ways. Even when I was young, my first short-term experiences were actually in Brazil with teen missions when I was 15 and 16 years old. But then God
mm,
brought us to my wife and I. We studied at Bethany Global University in Minneapolis. That's actually where we met. Bethany has an internship program, which is very crucial in missions training to have not just head knowledge, but have field experience. And so I
mm.
spent a year, as my wife did, here in Mexico City, actually, in 1981, 82.
Okay.
And yeah, I learned Spanish at an early age, 17 years old, youth of the mission in Argentina during the World Cup games, and then was sent
Okay.
here in my
Yeah.
early 20s as well.
Wow. Yeah. So for those of us who aren't fluent in more than one language, the curiosities abound. But I'm guessing you think in whatever language is being spoken in the context you're in. Is that a right way to say that? I don't
I
know.
think the real goal is becoming a bicultural person. And of course, to be a bicultural person, you're bilingual. And somebody
Right.
actually said that, how can you tell you're a bicultural person? And a good example is, you have point A, maybe my country of origin, the United States, and point B, Mexico, as being my host culture. And you're usually happiest when you're in between one or the other, So if I'm on a plane and I had my chilaquiles for breakfast in the morning here in Mexico and I'm flying to the US and going to meet a family member, that's when I'm the happiest. You're enjoying both cultures, but a bicultural person really is one who knows how to operate in both cultures.
Excellent. Yeah, that's a little bit different characterization. Of course, I've thought about it in terms of culturally fluent versus linguistically fluent, and I know that's a different level. You meet people who can speak a language, but they can't sync up with the environment or with people of that culture well. So I wrote that down: bicultural, bilingual, and then cultural fluency is able to flow in the cultures. Pretty cool reference. So you're living in Mexico City now. You've been there many years. You've worked in missions, your entire life. You can give us a quick rundown. You mentioned YWAM and some of the other stuff in the beginning. You want to give us a quick summary of what and lead us up to the now in terms of how you're serving?
Well, I've always considered myself a mobilizer. And I'll give you a good example of what really missions mobilization is in terms of a person that mobilizes others towards missions. Ralph Winter, the missiologist out of California, he's passed away a number of years ago, but I love what he said is that, a mobilizer is someone who, if you see a large building on fire, which is more strategic, getting a pail of water and trying to put out the flames by yourself, or calling up 100 sleeping firemen? And I guess that's really been my job, in essence, is, waking up the sleeping firemen inside the church and mobilizing others to go. Another thing that he said is that any missionary who can mobilize 100 other missionaries to the field should be doing that rather than going themselves. And so that's what we've done. We were
Wow.
missions pastors of the largest church here in Mexico for almost 2 decades. I've been in a new season in my life that we'll probably talk about here in a little while, the last 4 or 5 years. But those were very rich years, just mobilizing Mexicans to go to North Africa and China and India and lots of different places. And many of them are still on the field. And so a lot of what we have done has been mobilizing, and not just outside of Mexico, inside Mexico as well. We have graduates that have gone to the unreached indigenous peoples here within Mexico as well.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's something in the States, we don't think about it so much. I don't know the number of tribes that persist in Mexico. I have recently met a friend who, is working with an indigenous people group there and kind of freshened up my thoughts about it, got some more knowledge about that. But I'm sure there's a vast number of tribes that maintain their own culture there in Mexico. So it's certainly a mission field opportunity there as well.
Yeah, there's about 300 different languages here in Mexico. Most of them are in Oaxaca and Chiapas. But, if you count the Mixtecos 60 times because they have 60 dialects, and the Zapotecos 60 times, they have that many dialects, why we come up with an excess of 300 people groups here in the country.
Wow, that's amazing. I remember the first time I was ever on a team that was twice translated. That was pretty cool. I mean, we were in the remote mountains of Oaxaca. This would have been more than a decade ago now. But we were translated from English to Spanish to one of those dialects. I can't remember which one, but it was one of the mountain dialects in Oaxaca. And this language sounded so fascinating to me. I was just, the sound and the way it was rendered like nothing I'd ever heard, just so cool. Yeah. And the culture, of course, is just as rich. We were with those folks for some days and really got to appreciate them. So that's a blessing, huge blessing. So you touched on something that's pretty important to my heart as well. I want to be, in some ways, a mobilizer as well, to try to encourage Latin Americans to be active, step out in the world of missions. And you're way ahead of me on that. I got to say it, but I'm certainly hopeful to be a small force there. Does a story come to mind of maybe one or two of the missionaries you've seen sent from Mexico where they're working? I know when I was with you there in the early, I guess it was maybe 2012 or 13, we looked at a video of a guy who started a Mexican restaurant in China. I remember that story pretty clearly. But what comes to mind when you think about Latin Americans working in the foreign field? Maybe some examples or just some things that you've seen to be important in that regard?
Yeah, well, I think the first example I could give is of Mexico itself. I have a graduate that, one of many, but a graduate named Alejandro that's working in the state of Oaxaca. And he has one of the only missionary training schools in Oaxaca to train Mexicans to work with the unreached indigenous in Oaxaca. There are people groups in Mexico, indigenous groups that have large percentages of Christians, that go back 40, 50 years ago, that there was just a real move of God and a real response. But Alejandro is working in a region where there are Mixtec tribes of 1,500 people, and they're the only ones that speak that dialect, and there's not a single Christian. The Trique Indians are very close to where he's at as well, and he has workers amongst the Trique. But he's a guy that is just kind of replicating what I've done since I've been to Mexico. And I should probably throw in here too, sort of a leadership principle is that, we teach what we know, but we reproduce who we are. And that's the cool thing about being a mobilizer, is that I've been able to reproduce myself into others. And when I see a guy like Alejandro, who has the exact same vision, and of course, my wife and I make a commitment of going there once a year to teach, and sometimes twice. That's just a great example of a guy who's doing it. So Alejandro has 20 teams in 20 different indigenous areas, and just doing a fantastic job in a very difficult area here in Mexico, a pocket that is still unreached. And then I could just give multiple, examples of others that are out. I did a PowerPoint not too long ago of 21 of our students that have married foreigners, and 20 of the 21 are girls, single girls who have married guys from England, from Equatorial Guinea, Africa, Senegal, France, Germany. And that's really a great way to get to the field, because, you marry a foreign national and you go there to serve with them, and you have children that are born, and you just don't come back home.
Right. You totally absorb into the context. Wow. That's powerful. I've got 3 daughters myself, no sons, so I totally can relate to what you're saying right now. That makes a lot of sense to me, and is also inspiring. That is very neat. Thank God for his grace and for the advance of the gospel. Super thankful for what you guys have done and your contribution over time. It's been meaningful in so many lives. If we can shift gears here a little bit, I'd like to dig in some to what's your current assignment. You're working, I think you were involved with Bethany Global University, I guess as it's now called, but before it has a rich history. I know a little bit about Bethany's history, but I'd like to talk a little bit about your current assignment and what you guys are up to. I do see you, obviously we're friends on Facebook. I see you dotting the globe, not at this moment of recording. Obviously the world's shut down for the virus, but normally year over year, you're all over the place. And I'm impressed by your resilience. What is taking you to, I don't know how many countries you went to last year, but I know it was a number. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, I felt a few years back, actually 5 years ago, that God had a new chapter in our lives. And, we still continue to be in touch with people that we've sent from the megachurch here that are serving in different areas, but also others that are with other denominations or churches that are serving around the world or here in Mexico. We're definitely in contact with a lot of them. But 5 years ago, Bethany opened a door for me with my experience in mobilization and pastoring missionaries around the world to be their research coordinator, the international research coordinator for Bethany. And that's part of an alliance that we have called GlobeServe. And GlobeServe is an alliance of 300 missionary training schools around the world. I've had the opportunity to start 2 mission schools here in Mexico. Really, they were within the context of a Bible school in both contexts. So I've had, experience in missions training and mobilization, but we have a school. Our main university is in Minneapolis, Bethany Global University, as you mentioned, but we have a smaller school in Singapore. And that's called Bethany International University. You won't find hardly anything online because it's a bit clandestine, but not that much. But it exclusively trains Africans and Asians on a master's and doctoral level. And to get your master's, you have to go back to your country of origin and start a mission school. And hence all of the mission schools that we have in the network, by a few that have been started by Bethany missionaries, like myself, but the large majority are Africans and Asians. So I get to visit a lot of these schools, but really my job description is not so much with working with the schools as much as it is as tracking unreached people groups where the graduates are working.
Right. Yeah. The research coordination piece to me is very interesting. Is your research directly connected to the unreached people groups element? Is that what you're researching, or what's the focus on that?
Yeah. Well, in this alliance called GlobeServe, it's been around for about 25 years. Bethany is an organization that this year is turning 75 years old. And, I get to work with the partnership that we have worldwide, made up of nationals, as I mentioned. And the last 25 years, we've had a number of projects. The first project was just to start 100 schools or locate the 100 schools where we knew we had people. So we were kind of halfway there when we started the first initiative called Go 100. And then we moved to another initiative after reaching 100 training schools around the world. The second initiative was called Field 5000. And that was fielding 5,000 workers from these 100 schools, actually, in addition to 100. And now we know that there are over 300. But the last 5 years, I've worked with an initiative called Engage 500. And we got together in one of our triennial meetings, and we asked all of our partners, the representatives that were there, how many people groups are you engaging? And when I say people groups, they really were truly unreached people groups, which the definition for an unreached people group is 2% or less evangelical. And we found that we had 269 engagements, missionaries placed in 269 unreached people groups around the world. Well, we didn't know where those were. And so I've been researching those groups, but probably the most important part of Engage 500 are the additional 231 groups to, come up to 500 people groups that the last 5 years we've been working on. And so I get to go out and visit some of the workers that are on the front lines. Sometimes because of my American passport and my light skin, I can't get into places and I have to go in the back of a Suburban at night or, I've been in some dicey situations, let me tell you.
I can bet.
But
Wow.
I think one of the exciting things that has happened in the last few years is that we're not just, finding information, qualitative information as to where these groups are. And, I get to tell the stories that I can't publish on Facebook usually. But, I write articles and take pictures. I love photography.
I was going to mention that because you have not only do you love it, it loves you back. I mean, you have some incredible photos. And I was going to ask if you have a place that we could send people to see those, in the public sphere. I don't know. I know I see them on Facebook and I see all these people groups I'd never heard of and stuff like that. But is there a place for people to get access to your photos?
Other than my Facebook page, I do have a page in Spanish that really hasn't been up to date. That the address is idportolomundo.com. That in Spanish is goingtoalltheworld.com. In Spanish, ID por todo el mundo.com, and I have some pictures there. But kind of going back to the research, one of the things that we've done so that we're not just stuck into the quantitative mode is that with each of the people groups that I get to visit, we have a qualitative scale. I'll just mention real quickly what the scale is. It's from 1 to 7. Mm-hmm. And when we have an adoption, when a member of ours says, I want to adopt this unreached people group, I still don't have anybody prepared to send there, but they make a commitment just the same as we would adopt a child. And really that's the commitment that it requires because you're, making a commitment to send and support a worker there until churches are planted. Of course, that is level 1, the adoption level. Level 2 is that you have missionaries placed amongst that unreached people group. And of course, that's what we've been looking to do with the 500 groups around the world. We're just finishing it up. I'm about 5 unreached people groups away, and I'm constantly in contact with our partners to make sure that we fulfill our goal by June of this year, and that's not that far away. And we'll make it. We're there unofficially. But that's level 2 is when you see missionaries placed amongst an unreached people group. Level 3, again, talking about this qualitative scale, is that early disciples are made. And we worked with an unreached people group here in Mexico called the PAME years ago, the first group that I'd ever had contact with here in Mexico, really. And they were definitely at level 3 because I met the Bible translator who spent 40 years with this group, and all she had done is translate 2 gospels in 40 years, and she had 3 converts. So early disciples being made is level 3. But, when you're at level 3, what are you trying to do? Well, you're trying to start the first church, and that's level 4. Right. Level 4 is planting the first church. Level 5 is that indigenous church plants another church. You're seeing more than one church in existence. And then level 6 is something that we're going to be focusing on a lot more, and that is a church planting movement begins. And sadly, not many people see church planting movements. I don't know if you're familiar with the discipleship making movement term and the church planting term.
Somewhat, yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's level 6. Level 7 is that people group now sends their missionaries to another people group that's unreached. But we're seeing a lot of people, jumping from level 5, where you have more than one church, and then they're sending missionaries to other unreached people groups without going through stage 6 and seeing a real movement take place. And we'd like to spend probably our next goal after Engage 500 focusing on disciple-making movements. And we have a number of partners that are just fantastic examples of that, but we're asking ourselves, and we've got a couple guys that are really experts on this subject that are helping us, and that'll be our next goal the next 5 years probably.
Wow. Well, I would love to have, I don't know if you've got just a summary of that scale. Of course, I was taking some notes here. I'm sure I didn't get it all down. I love that scale, by the way. Extremely well thought through, it seems, and sort of the progression makes a lot of sense. I would love to maybe get a copy of that scale. and include it in our podcast notes that we're going to send as this publishes,
Absolutely.
along with your other links and such. Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah, I'm getting it prepared for you right now.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, it's interesting you mentioned that some people are jumping from 5 to 7. How does that, what do you do in that case? I mean, do you say, hold on, let's take a few steps back, or do you celebrate, or do you do both? I don't know.
Well, we have a guy that has done his doctorate on this subject as to the catalysts that God is using to start movements. And you look at, some of the things that you need in a team to see a movement start. Of course, everybody needs to have the same vision. That's number one. If you're in an organization, or, just it applies to churches and organizations, is if people aren't on the same page, it's not going to happen.
Right.
I can go back to the testimony that we have of Bethany Fellowship, which has turned into Bethany International. And of course, the college has changed its name a few times over the years. But, they had a vision to train, send, and support 100 missionaries. And
this was Bethany Fellowship in the early days.
Fellowship 75 years ago. You had 5 families that got together, and they sold everything that they had. They took all the money that they had in their bank accounts and put it in a pool, lived in a community. They actually, sold their homes, quit their jobs. All of them were businessmen. And one actually retained his job for a few years. He was the vice president of a large corporation there in Minneapolis. But they all moved to a mansion in downtown Minneapolis with the goal of sending 100 missionaries. And they really didn't have that much experience. But, I look back at the commitment of those 5 families, and then the successive families and individuals that have been a part of the organization. And it's just been a great testimony of giving everything you have to fulfill the vision, because they literally did it.
As you were highlighting this necessity and the catalyst part about synchronized vision, or everyone being on the same page, I think we can somehow trace back the impact in the generations that followed them. That clarity was so powerful. And, the clarity not only of the perception or, what God was leading them to do, but the, sort of the commitment as well. They saw it clearly, and they didn't have a small, like a marginal type of commitment to it. It was all in.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, wow, the shockwaves that have poured out from that fact. So powerful. So powerful. And this was, I guess, the seed that was planted in some ways of saying it, that is now, it's got branches in nearly every nation, and a whole lot of unreached people groups, as you're attesting. I think that's encouraging to me, but it's also challenging, which I think is maybe the signature of grace. I don't know, but I'm challenged there. Did you want to say anything else about the catalyst piece? What is required? I know you mentioned a few of those elements, but I want to make sure we hear you out on that.
Yeah, well, when it comes to catalyst, there's so many things that I could say. You really need to get one of our guys on that has a doctorate in this particular area. But
Would love to.
Yeah, and I could certainly set that up. But, they've gone through and they've looked at what are the characteristics of a successful catalyst who has been used by God to start movements. And when we say a movement, the definition that we're using, a lot of people are using, is 1,000 people, and that's gone deep to 3 or 4 generations. Generations doesn't mean you need to wait 40 years, but it's talking about the spiritual fruit, that I have a disciple that's makes another disciple that makes another disciple. And really, that's the heart of the Great Commission. I teach a lot on Matthew 28:18-20, the classic Great Commission verse where Jesus says that, he's given us all authority in heaven and earth. Go therefore, and he talks about 4 verbs. It says, go, make disciples, baptize, and teach all things. And, have a lot of people, especially young people with maybe a lot of zeal and not a lot of Bible knowledge, that would probably say that the go part is the most important. But when you look at Matthew 28, the imperative verb there is make a disciple. Because we can go, but if you just go, it could just be missionary tourism. Baptize a lot of people, but if they just get wet and they don't have a transformed life, they just got wet. And, the teaching, we can fill our head with lots of knowledge and teach or be taught.
Yeah.
But really the central part of the Great Commission is making a disciple that makes a disciple that makes a disciple. And so that's why we look at it at 4 generations, that if you look at Matthew 28, it really does have that 4 generations built into the text there. So that's what we're talking about. So, but the catalyst is the one who, we look at what is a fruitful worker. I was just on a webinar a couple nights ago with an organization that works exclusively in the Muslim world. We were looking at fruitful practices for movements. And, they have several categories, fruitful practices that relate to society and to seekers themselves in the Muslim context that, we call them seekers in other contexts too, related to believers and to leaders and communication methods and fruitful teams and what are the characteristics of fruitful churches. I've actually got that right in front of me right now. Just mentioned a few about the characteristics of a fruitful church. A fruitful church is one that uses the Bible as a central source for life. And we're talking about a cross-cultural context. So they use worship in indigenous forms of expression. They don't come in with their own ideas and say, you need to use a pipe organ here because that's what our denomination's used. They know how to contextualize. They practice baptism and they network together. They govern themselves. And we're seeing a lot of growth around the world in church settings that are not like you and I know the church. We live just a block and a half away from our Mexican church here that has 3 services of 3,000 on Sunday morning. And, you're in the Dallas area. There's a lot of mega churches around there too.
Sure are.
The problem comes when we try and replicate that in other cultures, because probably most of the church today worldwide is not a big auditorium with a fantastic worship group and a skinny pant pastor giving some great cultural examples from movies. I tend to see that a lot with Americans. But really, most of the churches worldwide and the churches that I get to visit after being in the context of a mega church for so many years is a small group of Christians, 8, 10, 12, that are in a living room, and they're probably singing in a low voice because if the neighbors hear, why, they're in jail. And if you're a foreigner, you're kicked out of the country. And that's the context of the church worldwide. And maybe that's what we're learning right now as we go through this situation with the coronavirus, is that we need to be a little more creative and understand the church isn't where we go. The church is who we are.
Man, that is such an inspiring description that you make there. And I think a valid one. I think so much of our movements in our times, I'm talking about my home culture, or in the U.S., I'll say. I think it's also true in maybe a little bit less of a sense in other places where the culture's been exported. But, there's a hollow ring to so much of what we're doing. And I think this is an opportunity for us to, listen to the dissonance of the sound we're producing and make some adjustments. I pray that's our takeaway. I pray we do that. But the richness of that description, thank you for that. That's very encouraging. And I think it's also inspiring to those of us who are looking for the real in the midst of the shiny, Yeah, very, very powerful. One thing I wanted to make sure and get to, and thank you for all those things. You speak a lot, as you'd mentioned to me, about the difference between missions and evangelism. And I want to make sure and take a minute on that as we probably got 5 minutes left. I wanted to make sure and give you a chance to talk some about that specifically.
Sure. I published a book a couple of years ago, only in Spanish. And I'll get a copy to you, Scott.
Okay. I'll read it very slowly.
Yeah. Anyway, the title is Not Everybody is a Missionary. And that's just to get people's attention. The subtitle is that, but everybody's called to fulfill the Great Commission in one way or another.
Mm.
You know, I know that evangelistically, I love what Lauren Cunningham from YWAM says. He says either everybody's a missionary or a mission field. And that's true in an evangelistic sense. But in a missional sense, in a cross-cultural strategic sense, that's not true. If everybody's a missionary, that means that every Christian in the world can stay where they're at. Nobody needs to go from point A to point B, and the Great Commission will be fulfilled by itself. No.
Yeah.
God is still moving in the hearts of Americans to go to the ends of the earth. He's still sending Americans to China and Americans to India and Indians to Myanmar and people from Myanmar to the neighboring state of Laos. And so that's one of the things that I find in the local church, especially in Latin America, but it's really quite universal, is a confusion with the term evangelism and missions. And if we call everything missions, we'll never be involved in what really missions are. And so a real simple definition of evangelism and missions is that evangelism is raising up the church where the church is already at. And missions is raising up the church where the church does not exist or where it's just taking root. And if we use that as a definition, and, you know, I've got a lot of Bible verses that I could quote, but probably the main one would be, you know, Romans 15:20, that just shows the passion of the Apostle Paul. You know, he says, I made it my ambition to preach the gospel, not where Christ was named, and not to build on another man's foundation. So, you know, putting another church up on the other side of the street in Dallas, Texas, where there's another church on the other side of the street, is not strategic. And a lot of what we call missions is really going to places where the church already exists. And so that's why I've been so excited about, you know, in working with unreached people groups around the world and getting to tribal groups where there still is not the first Christian, or getting to a place where the church is just beginning to start. And that really is the passion of the Apostle Paul. But sad to say, you know, a lot of pastors just don't have that passion. And so that's where missions comes into play. And probably only one in 100 or 1 or 2 or 300 in a congregation are really going to have that apostolic call to go where there is no church. But that really has become my passion, and my life's calling is to raise up others to go to the difficult places, because we've gone to all the easy places. The difficult places are the ones that remain, you know, the Muslim world, the Buddhist world, the Hindu world, and the tribal world. And so that's where we need to put our focus to finish the Great Commission.
The way you characterize that is, it's like a cold cup of water splashed right in the face of so much that's going on, you know, maybe, you know, to drink as well. But I think that's helpful to give us some perspective on the way we're misusing our characterizations. And it's good to understand that, I think, and also bring that understanding to bear on our behaviors. You see so much of what's going on in our times is trying to legitimize, you know, ourselves in an expression of something we find familiar or desirable, not to throw everyone under the bus in terms of what people are doing for the gospel, but to have that clarity and to continue the pursuit, you know, that Paul was motivated by, as you mentioned there in Romans 15. I think it's maybe a little more foreign. I think a lot of times we use titles and descriptions of ourselves in ministry, you know, as a means of self-congratulation rather than a functional description of what it is that our heart's beating to do and what we're trying to see as a result of our lives. Very encouraging.
Yeah, well, I enjoyed your comment there too. Just so many people are caught up in titles, and it's not about having a title. It's really the function, as you mentioned, you know, and I'll go back to the statement that we teach what we know, but we reproduce who we are.
Wow. That speaks. It needs no further elaboration, but I think that is very real and demonstrable. I think that's what we see happening. Lord, raise us up to that level of stature, of courage, and resilience to see the Great Commission
Amen.
in every tongue, tribe, people, and nation. Lord, help us. Powerful stuff, Kerry. Really, I'm just gripped by who you are and what God's doing with your life. I really, really appreciate the chance to talk to you about it. I feel like we've touched only the surface and more to come here for sure. Look forward to seeing you again. There's an off chance I'll be in Mexico City in the late summer. So as those plans develop, if you're not in the in the far reaches of the world by then, maybe we can see each other. It'd be great to have a time together as well. Please give my greetings to your wife there with you. I'm super thankful. I'd like to just do a few more things here as we're closing out. Anything else that you wanted to mention that you didn't have a chance to? And also if people want to find out more about what you do or your organization you're working with, something of a contact thread for them to find out more, that would be good.
Yeah, I'll prepare that information so you can put it on the podcast link with these 7 pages as well.
Awesome. Thank
I'll
you.
link to where I have some pictures. So, yeah, be glad to do it.
Great. Very, very good. Well, thank you so much for being with us. I'm stirred. I can say that. And I believe that'll be the effect. And it certainly is my hope that we who are hearing these words will be stirred for purposeful expression. So many distractions in the world around us to keep us from even a partial expression of God's intent when he gave us life. So I pray we'll be stirred to get to that place of fruitfulness that we're called to. So just if you don't mind, Kerry, would you mind to close us out in prayer?
Be glad to. Heavenly Father, you say in your word to pray to the Lord of the harvest that he sends forth workers to his harvest. And I know, Lord, that that's a very dangerous prayer, because if we're truly doing it, we just might hear you say, you go. And so, Lord, we just want to tell you once again that we're willing to go wherever you send us. Help us, Lord, to be aware of those that have already been sent and to be a blessing to them. Thank you for Scott and his ministry and just the blessing that he's been here in Mexico and other countries as well. Blessing nationals. Help us to raise up our eyes, Lord, and as we raise up our eyes fall away from ourselves and we begin to see the world as you see it. And we desire to see many, many more workers sent to the difficult places, Lord. Would you raise them up in the United States? Would you raise them up in Mexico? Would you raise them up in many other countries and other cultures, Lord? And we know that all of this is so that we can fulfill your great commission that still has not been completed. And with eyes of faith, we thank you for what you are going to do. And we bless you because you are the Lord of the harvest. In Jesus' name.
Amen, Kerry. Thank you so much. Thanks for that. Thanks for your encouragement and for your service for the King and his kingdom. And look forward to catching up with you soon. And maybe we'll get you back on to tell some more of the stories as they're unfolding in your work. We certainly pray for you and for the efforts you're expending and for your fruitfulness. We'll watch for those notes, get them attached so folks can see a little bit more about what you guys are up to and how to find out more. Many blessings to you, bro.
Thank you.
I am Scott McClellan with your FX Missions From the Forefront podcast. Please rate us on iTunes, Stitcher, wherever you get your podcast content. Thank you for being a part of FX Missions From the Forefront.
You've been listening to From the Forefront, hosted by FX Missions' Scott McClelland. If you've enjoyed this episode and you'd like more information on today's guest, please go to our Facebook page at facebook.com/FXmissions. Please rate our show on iTunes or your favorite podcast provider. If you know someone who should be a guest on our podcast, we're currently reviewing candidates for upcoming episodes. Please submit their name, affiliation, and an essay of why their story needs to be told to info@fxmissions.com. And of course, you can always follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and our website at fxmissions.com. From Scott McClelland and the whole team here at FX Missions, thanks for listening. Till next time, have a great day.